I'm Cynthia Bonner, and I'm chair of the Civility Committee, and I am working as the Chief of Staff and Director of Administration for the Division of Student Affairs, and we're here in my office in Burris Hall.
My name is Kevin Ayub, and I'm the Coordinator of Event Planning for Student Centers and Activities, formerly UUSA, and my office is located in Squire Student Center on the second floor in Suite 221.
In terms of civility, I think at its most basic level we're talking about courtesy, politeness, manners, things that make us good community citizens. But we found as we talked with students that many don't go beyond that level and think about it in a higher order. But when you read the book that our committee read, which is called Civility, or Choosing Civility by Forney, he talks about it as civility being a code of behavior based on respect, restraint, and responsibility. And that's really in terms of respecting people who are different, respecting our environment, respecting our shared space. When you're in a residence hall, it's respecting people's quiet, their sleep, their possessions. In terms of restraint, it's thinking before you act, thinking what will this impact my behavior, how will it impact someone else? Will this, when I react to something or want to say or do something, will it be a positive impact, will it be helpful, or will it be detrimental? So it's restraining yourself and thinking before you act or speak, and then also taking responsibility for your actions. Accepting the fact that if you take action, you can't wait for other people to take the first move, that it's important that we, if we see something that needs to be done, it could be simple like trash to be picked up, or it could be being kind to someone else. It could be a variety of things. So it's up to us to make those decisions.
When I think about that question, I go back to our first meeting as a group, and Dr. Bonner actually challenged us from the beginning with asking us to share an example of a time or instance when we may have been uncivil in our everyday lives. And it was interesting to take a step back and think maybe of an instance or incident where maybe we weren't too proud of ourselves or the way we conducted ourselves or carried ourselves. And it was a good exercise to kind of start the ball rolling. Because when we started talking about the topic of civility, we realized quickly how broad it was. And I think that was what surprised me the most in starting out talking about civility. Granted, I feel we started on the right foot by picking up a great text and choosing civility, and it provided us with context so we could have conversations and a common language, but at the same time it almost broaden the scope of the topic because we realized how broad the topic of civility really is. Generally, the feeling from the committee and from speaking with folks on campus is that at the lower level stuff like manners and politeness, campus is doing pretty well. I think starting out, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, well, what should we do when we didn't really quite know where campus was at, and so we started by talking with students first. And we met with two different groups of students. We met with a group of RAs, first-year RAs, and I believe it was like their weekly training class. And we met with that group of RAs to discuss topics of civility, whether they see civility in action on campus, whether they see civility lacking. We asked them their opinions on how you learn something like civility or how they think their fellow classmates will learn civility. We also met with a second group of students in the residence halls, and these were just residents living in one of the communities, one of the facilities in the President's community, I believe. and we went out to a weekly dinner with them, and after dinner we posed the same questions to that group of students, in which some of the responses were similar to the RA class, but they were definitely a different population, and so we also got a different perspective from them. And as I said before, some of the lower level practices of civility, like holding doors open, we heard a lot, and people said, oh, campus is great, people hold doors open. And then recently we also participated at the tunnel event sponsored by Residence Life, and we had a table with a banner and a simple question, got civility? And groups of students came through the tunnel and spoke to the committee about the Division of Student Affairs, the learning aspirations, and then specifically our aspiration, civility. And we posed some of the same questions to those students that came through. We heard some similar responses, and then there were a few other responses for some things we hadn't heard, in which students highlighted some uncivil behavior that they didn't appreciate on campus. And so from those groups of students, we hope to take that information to formulate what we think students would want to see in a program or would be effective way to present this topic in the future.
Okay. And I think one of the things that we need to also do is start to work with staff on how we can enable them to have some of those difficult conversations with students, to ask the poignant questions that will challenge them to think about their behavior and how they interact with other people. So I think that's another step we're going to want to take as a committee.
And I think we all really enjoyed the Forney book, and find that is a simple enough read that it's a great platform for people to start there and pick up the book and start thinking about civility, and it'll enable them to have those conversations with students, and give them the framework to approach this aspiration specifically.
Well, I think in terms of the learning aspirations, I think they serve as a wonderful framework for our department and our Division of Student Affairs in terms of how we can collaborate and work together, because they give us some common areas of focus. And I think we're seeing evidence now all the way across the division of how departments are beginning to rally around them and to talk about how we can work together to enable us to accomplish some of the achievements that we want to make in those areas. And I guess one of the things I would like to see us do as the university develops its strategic plan, to be able to infuse our division's aspirations into that strategic plan. And even if perhaps they're not part of the plan, at least see how we can collaborate and support the university's strategic plan using our aspirations as that framework. So I think they've really invigorated our division and given us a kind of a new outlook on what we're doing.
We've only really just begun to start actually writing our learning outcomes and putting them on paper, and then trying to identify ways to assess those outcomes. We've even debated whether or not a learning outcome should be that students will create their own definition of civility, or we create a definition of civility that students then would comprehend and adopt and accept. So far we don't quite have those established, but we have been talking about how students will create their own definition of civility, where students will choose to practice civility, and students will be able to describe the consequences of their actions and what those consequences have on themselves and others. And we've identified a few ways we may be able to assess those outcomes. But regardless, before we even started this work, in having conversations with students in those focus groups and at the tunnel, we see that the students do understand some of the aspects of our aspirations, and some of them are aware that these aspirations exist. And this past October, in the wake of the tragedy at Rutgers University with the student Tyler Clemente that took his own life, there was an amazing editorial that a Virginia Tech student wrote to the Roanoke Times that was published, in which the student actually cites the Division of Student Affairs aspirations in the editorial, and specifically pointed out the civility aspiration, and the parts of the aspiration that she chose to highlight were some of the higher level aspects of civility and practicing civility, in which I'd like to share with you. She said that the message calls for students to practice consideration, respect, and courtesy in their day-to-day lives and interactions with each other. It asks that we try to, and then she quotes the aspiration, understand each other in our commonalities and differences, and combine free speech with reasoned expression. And then she goes on to say, maybe it's time we take that message to heart. So to see a student knows these exist and can relate something she's seen in the news and something is real to what the Division of Student Affairs is trying to provide as a learning outcome for students is reassuring that we're headed in the right direction and that students do know these exist and are out there.
Yeah, it'll be really exciting if we see more and more of those references cropping up as we move forward. Well, as we were doing our focus groups with students, there were frequent mentions of example of people hold their doors for each other going in and out of buildings here at Virginia Tech. And just using that example as a springboard for some of the other discussions we've had, we realized that the way civility is manifested in a culture is not always the same across cultures. That in some countries, holding doors for other people may not be considered polite because they're letting hot air out of a building or letting the heat escape, or maybe in the summer the cool air escape. And so it's not considered necessarily an act of kindness, and that we have to realize that some of the behaviors that demonstrate civility may be different. And even Forney in his book talks about the fact that he's from Italy, and it's a much more formal culture than in the United States. And so he's taken aback, even now, having lived here for a while, when people immediately call him by his first name or refer to him in a very casual way, which is very different from the culture he grew up in Italy. And so even though civility is an accepted concept, it's the manifestation of civility and the civil behaviors that might be different across cultures. And similarly, when we think about holding doors for other people and going into residence halls, it really raises the bigger question of, is being polite to that person behind you in essence being uncivil to everybody else in the building? If you're letting in a stranger who doesn't belong in the building, are you jeopardizing the safety of everyone? So how do you balance that thinking between the greater good and the immediate person next to you, and make the right decision in that case? And it's not an easy either or black and white question, but it's one that we really have to look at more deeply.
And I'd just add, I think that regardless of cultural differences, the root of it all is that we want people to understand that their actions always have consequences for not only themselves but for those around them, and that's important when thinking about living here in this community and being a member of this community. But just as when we spoke with students, we hear some great things about how great the community is and how friendly, and that sense of community and civility go hand in hand, but sometimes it may mask issues that we still do have, though, that aren't on the surface, though, because there is such a great sense of Hokie community here, though.
And I would want to just say, as I pass the torch to Kevin Ayoub, who's going to chair this committee next year, that I'm going to pass my Kindness Matters sign so that he can keep that as we don't have a gavel for the committee chair, but we do have our Kindness Matters plaque. So
thank you
Kevin,
very much.
It's all yours.
Thank you.